Sarah Mitchell had been just a mom at Lakeside Elementary for 3 years, and that's exactly how she preferred it. Every morning at 7:30 a.m., she'd slip through the school gates in her faded blue jeans and casual sweater, ponytail swaying as she walked to the PTA meeting room. The other parents barely looked up anymore, just another stay-at-home mom volunteering for school events nobody else wanted to organize. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "Morning, cupcake lady," Principal Robert Daniels would call out with a smirk, not bothering to learn her actual name. At 34, Sarah had perfected the art of blending into the background, while the important parents with prestigious careers dominated the conversations. She organized the bake sales, coordinated the fundraisers, and arranged the field trips with methodical precision. But Sarah carried secrets in her quiet movements. When she thought no one was watching, she'd examine the school's outdated security system with the critical eye of an expert. She'd unconsciously scan rooms for tactical advantages when entering. Her eyes would track potential threats with military precision, and she'd wince when the school's emergency protocols revealed dangerous flaws that would have earned her a stern lecture from her former commander. Major Thomas Mitchell had been a legend. Special Forces operator, combat instructor, weapons specialist, the kind of soldier other soldiers spoke about in hushed tones. He trained Sarah from the day they met at the shooting range when she was 19 until his death in a car accident 4 years ago. But that was a lifetime ago, and now she was just another face in the PTA crowd, invisible and unremarkable. The first warning sign came on a Tuesday morning when she arrived to find Mr. Peterson, the shop teacher, struggling with a jammed lock on the supply cabinet. The mechanism was stuck solid, and frustration was written all over his weathered face. "Need help?" she offered quietly, setting down her stack of fundraiser flyers. Peterson looked up, surprised. "You know about locks?" "A little." Sarah's hands moved with practiced precision, manipulating the lock in seconds. She cleared the jam, checked the mechanism, and had it working smoothly in moments. "There. Should work fine now." Peterson stared at her with new respect. "Where'd you learn to do that?" Before Sarah could answer, Principal Daniels' voice cut through the morning air. "Mitchell, what do you think you're doing?" Sarah looked up to find Daniels striding toward them, his face dark with irritation. "Just helping with a stuck lock, Mr. Daniels." "Did I ask for your help?" Daniels' voice carried the authority of someone who enjoyed wielding power over parents. "You're a volunteer. That means you stuff envelopes, organize bake sales, and stay out of staff matters. You don't touch school equipment." "But You were just overstepping your bounds." Daniel's cold blue eyes fixed on her. "Do you even have security clearance to access that cabinet? Because if you don't, you have no business putting your hands on school property." Sarah felt her cheeks burn. "No, Mr. Daniels, I don't have clearance." "Then stick to what you're qualified for. Cupcakes are over there." Daniels turned to Peterson. "And next time you have a problem with equipment, you bring it to me or the maintenance staff, not some mom who thinks she knows better." As Daniels walked away, Sarah caught a glimpse of Vice Principal Jessica Carter watching from across the hallway. Unlike the others, she seemed to actually see Sarah not just as another volunteer mom, but as a person with thoughts and capabilities. Their eyes met for a moment before Sarah looked away, focusing on her fundraiser flyers. But Vice Principal Carter had noticed something in that brief interaction. Sarah's movements hadn't been those of an amateur fumbling with unfamiliar equipment. Her hands had moved with the confidence of someone who'd handled security systems thousands of times. Someone who'd been trained by an expert. The thought nagged at her as she watched Sarah return to her quiet routine, once again fading into the background. There was more to this woman than met the eye, and she was beginning to suspect that Lakeside Elementary was about to learn just how much they'd underestimated the quiet mom in the blue jeans. That afternoon, as Sarah methodically sorted through donation items for the school auction, she allowed herself a small smile. Let them think she was just another invisible mom. She had her husband's lessons to keep her company, 4 years of grieving turned into preparation, and the patience to wait for the right moment to honor everything he taught her. She just hadn't expected that moment to come so soon. The mockery started small but grew like a cancer. It began with whispered comments Sarah pretended not to hear as she worked around the school. "Look at Cupcake Mom playing with the big people's problems," Jennifer Walsh, head of the school board, would snicker to her friends. Maybe she thinks she's going to save the school single-handedly. Principal Daniels seemed to take particular pleasure in making Sarah's life difficult. He assigned her the most tedious tasks, cataloging decades-old textbooks, reorganizing the supply closets with obsessive precision, sorting through mountains of lost and found items that no one would ever claim. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When she completed these tasks flawlessly, he'd find new ways to remind her of her place. "Mitchell," his voice would boom across the hallway, "those auction items better be categorized perfectly. I don't want to see a single mistake in the catalog." Then, when she'd finish organizing them to perfection, he'd casually rearrange several items just to create disorder. Try again. Can't have parents seeing this mess. But Sarah endured it all with quiet dignity, her husband's voice echoing in her memory. "Excellence doesn't need an audience, Sarah Bear. Do your work right, whether anyone's watching or not." What Daniels didn't know was that Sarah was learning. Every day she arrived early and stayed late, absorbing every detail of the school's operations. She studied the security systems, noting their weaknesses and vulnerabilities. She observed the emergency protocols, identifying flaws that could put children at risk. She recorded everything in a worn notebook that never left her side. Vice Principal Carter began to notice her dedication. Unlike the others, she'd actually read Sarah's volunteer application. Stay-at-home mom, former office administrator, excellent references from community service. But something didn't add up. No civilian volunteer had this level of focus, this intense attention to detail. "Sarah," she called out one morning after another brutal session with Daniels. Sarah looked up from where she was methodically sorting through auction donations, her hands steady despite the principal's earlier tirade. "Yes, Miss Carter? You've been here 3 years. What made you volunteer for all these extra tasks?" Sarah considered her answer carefully. "I needed something meaningful to do, and I'm good with details." "That's not what I meant." Carter sat down across from her, her voice gentle but probing. "Most parents would have quit after a week of Daniel's treatment. Why do you stay?" Sarah's hand stilled on the item she was cataloging. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes, a depth of pain and purpose that caught Carter off guard. Then the mask slipped back into place. "I have my reasons, Miss Carter." Before Carter could probe further, Daniel's voice cut through the air. "Mitchell, stop socializing and get back to work. Those auction items won't catalog themselves." But Carter had seen enough. That evening, she made a call to an old friend in the military personnel office. If Sarah Mitchell was hiding something, she was going to find out what. The answer came back the next morning, buried in a file that made her blood run cold. Sarah Mitchell, née Walker. Former Army Special Forces support specialist. Expert in weapons systems, tactical operations, and security protocols. Wife of Major Thomas Mitchell, decorated Special Forces operator killed in a car accident 4 years ago while transporting classified equipment. Suddenly, everything made sense. The way Sarah handled mechanical systems with unconscious familiarity, her intense focus on security details, the pain Carter had glimpsed in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. She wasn't just some volunteer mom. She was the widow of a Special Forces legend, carrying her husband's legacy in silence. That afternoon, Daniel's harassment reached a new level. He'd found a broken projector in the library and was berating Sarah as if it were her fault. "This is what happens when unqualified people touch school equipment," he snarled, holding up the damaged device. "You probably broke this trying to play teacher." Sarah stood at attention, taking the abuse without a word, but Carter saw her hands clench into fists at her sides, saw the muscle in her jaw twitch with suppressed emotion. "That projector was already damaged, Mr. Daniels," she said quietly. "I documented it in my volunteer report 3 days ago." Daniels' face darkened. "Are you calling me a liar, Mitchell?" "No, sir. I'm stating a fact." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Other teachers had stopped their work to watch the confrontation, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "Maybe it's time you learned your place," Daniels said slowly. "From now on, you arrive at 7 a.m. instead of 7:30, and you stay until everyone else is gone. Maybe some extra hours will teach you about respect." Sarah nodded silently, but Carter saw something change in her expression. The quiet acceptance was still there, but underneath it something harder was beginning to form. Major Mitchell's wife was waking up, and Daniels had no idea what storm he was about to unleash. That night, Sarah sat in her modest suburban home, staring at a framed photo of her husband in his dress uniform. His military honors hung on the wall beside it: Bronze Star, Silver Star, Purple Heart, and numerous commendations that spoke of a life of service and sacrifice. "I'm trying to honor you the right way, Tom," she whispered to the photograph, "but I don't know how much longer I can stay invisible." She opened her notebook and began writing, recording not just security vulnerabilities, but everything she'd observed about the school's emergency protocols, their weaknesses, their equipment failures. If they wanted to push her to her breaking point, they were going to discover that Thomas Mitchell had trained his wife well. The quiet war at Lakeside Elementary was about to become something much more dangerous. Governor William Hayes arrived at Lakeside Elementary like a storm front, his reputation preceding him by a week of nervous preparations. The man who'd built his political career on school safety reforms was coming to evaluate the district's emergency preparedness program, and everyone knew heads would roll if they didn't measure up. Sarah watched from the shadows as the school transformed itself. Hallways were polished to mirror brightness, classrooms arranged to perfect order, and Principal Daniels' already harsh demeanor became absolutely brutal. "The governor expects perfection," Daniels snarled during a pre-dawn inspection of her work. "And if you embarrass me in front of him, I'll make sure you never volunteer at another school in this district again." Sarah nodded silently, but inside something was crystallizing. For 3 years she'd endured the mockery, the dismissal, the casual cruelty. She told herself it was enough to honor her husband's memory through quiet excellence. But as she watched Daniels swagger through the hallways, puffing up his chest for the governor's visit, she realized that silence could be its own form of cowardice. The breaking point came 2 days before Hayes' arrival. Sarah was performing her usual morning routine when she overheard a conversation that made her blood freeze. "I don't care if she's been here 3 years," Daniels was telling Vice Principal Carter. "During the governor's visit, all non-essential personnel stay away from the security demonstration. That includes our little cupcake princess." "But sir," Carter replied, "she knows the building better than anyone. Her suggestions about the security protocols have been invaluable." "She's a volunteer mom with delusions of grandeur," Daniels scoffed harshly. "The last thing we need is some wannabe security expert making us look bad in front of Hayes. She can arrange refreshments while the professionals demonstrate proper emergency protocols." Sarah felt something inside her chest snap. Not break, snap like a rifle bolt sliding into place. For 3 years, she'd been the invisible woman, the helpful background figure who made everyone else look good. But she was Thomas Mitchell's wife, and her husband hadn't raised her to accept disrespect quietly. That afternoon, she made a decision that would change everything. Vice Principal Carter found her in the storage room after hours, methodically examining the school's emergency response kit with movements so precise they looked like a meditation. She'd opened the case with the casual familiarity of someone who'd performed this task thousands of times. "Sarah," she said quietly, "we need to talk." Sarah looked up, and for the first time since Carter had known her, she didn't immediately look away. "Yes, Miss Carter? I know who your husband was." The words hung in the air between them. Sarah's hands stilled on the emergency equipment, and when she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Then you know why I can't just walk away." Carter sat down across from her. "Thomas Mitchell was one of the finest Special Forces operators I ever heard of. His security consultation at Westlake School in 2018 has saved 30 lives when that tornado hit." Sarah's eyes widened. "You knew Tom?" "I was the vice principal at Westlake before coming here. Your husband completely reorganized our emergency response protocols. When that EF4 tornado hit without warning, not a single child was injured because of his work." Sarah resumed her inspection of the equipment, but her movements had changed. There was purpose in them now, a sense of destiny approaching. "What are you suggesting, Miss Carter?" Quote, "I'm suggesting that maybe it's time Lakeside Elementary learned what Thomas Mitchell taught his wife." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a worn challenge coin, its surface polished smooth by years of handling. "This was his," she said. "He used it to teach me about precision under pressure." "Every action has to count," he'd say, "because you never know when someone's life might depend on it." Carter studied the coin, understanding flooding through her. "The demonstration for Governor Hayes is tomorrow." "I know." Sarah's voice was steady now, filled with quiet resolution. "And I think it's time the governor learned that Thomas Mitchell's lessons didn't die with him." She reassembled the emergency kit with fluid precision, every movement economical and sure. When she was finished, she looked directly at Carter with eyes that reminded her of battlefield veterans she'd known. "Miss Carter, I need to ask you a favor." "Name it." "Tomorrow, when they're struggling to impress the governor, give me one chance, one opportunity. That's all I need." Carter felt a chill run down her spine. She'd seen that look before in the eyes of people who were about to do something impossible. "Sarah, if this goes wrong..." "It won't." She stood, placing the emergency kit back exactly where it belonged. "My husband spent years preparing me for this moment. I just didn't know it until now." As she walked away, Carter realized that the quiet volunteer mom who'd been invisible for 3 years was about to become the most important person in the school. Tomorrow, Lakeside Elementary would discover that they'd been harboring a legend in disguise, and Principal Daniels was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his career. The morning of Governor Hayes's demonstration arrived with the crisp clarity of autumn in New England. Sarah stood at her bathroom mirror at 6 a.m., braiding her hair with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. Today felt different, like standing at the edge of a cliff knowing that the next step would either be flight or freefall. She'd barely slept, her mind cycling through emergency protocols and security measures that her husband had drilled into her memory. "Mental preparation is half the battle, Sir Bear," his voice echoed in her thoughts. "When the moment comes, your body will know what to do if your mind is ready." At the school, the atmosphere was electric with nervous energy. State officials had arrived in black SUVs, their presence adding weight to every interaction. Security consultants set up expensive equipment, their cameras positioned to capture what they hoped would be an impressive display of school safety protocols. Sarah arrived at her usual time, but instead of being directed to the demonstration area, she was stopped at the entrance by Roger Jenkins, the school security guard. "Sorry, Mitchell," he said, not looking particularly sorry. "Classified demonstration today. All non-essential personnel restricted to the cafeteria for refreshment preparation." Sarah nodded politely, but Vice Principal Carter, who'd been waiting nearby, stepped forward. "She's with me, Roger. Governor's special request." It was a lie, but Jenkins didn't question it. Carter led Sarah to a position near the gymnasium where she could observe without interfering. She pulled out her worn notebook and began reviewing the school's emergency protocols with the intensity of someone preparing for battle. "The evacuation route they're planning to demonstrate is flawed," she murmured, more to herself than to Carter. "They're routing third-grade classrooms through the east hallway, but that creates a bottleneck at the emergency exit. And they've got the wrong type of fire suppression equipment staged in the science wing." Carter watched her work, marveling at the transformation. This wasn't the quiet mom who'd endured Daniel's abuse for 3 years. This was Thomas Mitchell's wife, and she was in her element. Governor Hayes arrived exactly on time, his presence commanding immediate attention. Sarah studied him from a distance, noting the way he carried himself. The confidence of someone who'd made school safety his political cornerstone, the slight limp from an old sports injury, the way his eyes constantly scanned for details. This was a man who understood the weight of responsibility for children's lives. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hayes's voice carried across the gymnasium without amplification. "Today we demonstrate why Lakeside Elementary will become the model for school safety in our state." Principal Daniels stood at attention, chest puffed with pride. He'd selected his best staff members for the demonstration, confident that their performance would secure his promotion to district superintendent. He had no idea that his greatest threat was sitting 50 feet away with a notebook and a challenge coin. The first demonstration began with a simulated lockdown. Sarah watched through narrowed eyes, immediately spotting the problems. "Communication breakdown," she whispered to Carter. "The East Wing didn't receive the alert, and look, 3 classrooms with doors still unsecured." The simulation continued, with staff members fumbling through protocols they clearly hadn't practiced enough. Sarah winced as if she'd been physically struck with each error. The second demonstration attempted to showcase the school's evacuation plan. Sarah watched as confused teachers led students in the wrong directions, creating dangerous clusters at exit points. "The flow pattern is all wrong," she said quietly. "They're creating targets, not escape routes." With each failure, Governor Hayes' jaw tightened, and Sarah could see the disappointment building in his steel-gray eyes. During a break in the demonstrations, she scribbled frantically in her notebook, recording not just the protocol failures but the precise nature of each mistake. Years of her husband's training had taught her to see patterns where others saw only confusion. "They're treating this like a performance instead of preparation for a real emergency," she explained to Carter. "They're focusing on looking good for the cameras instead of moving children to safety efficiently. Every second they waste posturing could cost lives in a real situation." Carter stared at her in amazement. "How can you possibly know all this from here?" Sarah looked up from her notebook, and for the first time, Carter saw a warrior's legendary focus burning in her eyes. "Because I've been preparing for this my entire marriage, Miss Carter. I just didn't know it until now." As the demonstration continued to deteriorate, Sarah felt a familiar calm settling over her. This was the moment her husband had been preparing her for, not just to recognize security flaws, but to step forward when others had failed, to honor the legacy he'd left in her hands. She stood up, brushing dust from her blue jeans, and checked her watch. The final demonstration would begin in 10 minutes. A showcase of the school's emergency equipment and rapid response capabilities. "Miss Carter," she said quietly, "it's time." Carter looked at her, seeing not the invisible volunteer but the wife of a legend stepping into her destiny. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah touched the challenge coin in her pocket, feeling its familiar weight. "My husband used to say that being ready isn't about feeling confident. It's about being prepared to act when the moment demands it." She started walking toward the demonstration area, each step carrying her closer to a confrontation that would either vindicate 3 years of quiet endurance or destroy her volunteer status forever. Behind her, Vice Principal Carter followed, knowing that she was about to witness something that would be talked about for years to come. At the entrance to the gym, Sarah paused and looked back at the school where she'd spent countless hours in silence. Then she turned toward the future, toward the moment when Thomas Mitchell's wife would finally step out of the shadows. The demonstration was about to become something nobody had expected. Sarah approached the demonstration area with steady steps, her heart hammering against her ribs but her breathing controlled. The state officials were checking their watches, security consultants were packing up equipment, and Governor Hayes looked like a man watching his educational initiative evaporate before his eyes. Vice Principal Carter caught up with her just as Principal Daniels noticed their approach. His face darkened when he saw Sarah walking toward the demonstration area. "What's she doing here?" Daniels demanded, stepping into their path. "I gave specific orders." "Stand down, Robert," Carter interrupted, her voice carrying new authority. "Mrs. Mitchell has a request for the governor." Daniels' eyes narrowed dangerously. "A request? She's a volunteer. She doesn't get to make requests during a classified demonstration." But Sarah was already past him, walking directly toward Governor Hayes, with the purposeful stride of someone who'd made an irrevocable decision. The gymnasium fell silent as conversation stopped mid-sentence, all attention focusing on the quiet woman who'd been invisible for 3 years. "Governor Hayes," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly in the large space. "I have a request, sir." Hayes turned, his steel-gray eyes studying her with the intensity of someone who'd survived in politics by reading people quickly and accurately. "And you are?" "Sarah Mitchell, sir, volunteer parent coordinator." She paused, then added quietly, "Wife of Major Thomas Mitchell, Special Forces." The name hit Hayes like a physical blow. Sarah watched recognition dawn in his eyes, followed by something that might have been pain, then respect. The entire gymnasium had gone dead silent, waiting to see how this unprecedented interruption would play out. "Thomas Mitchell," Hayes said slowly. "Westlake School, 2018. "Yes, sir. You were a state senator then." Hayes nodded, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Your husband saved a lot of lives that day. What's your request, Mrs. Mitchell?" Sarah felt the weight of every eye in the room, but her husband's training held her steady. "Permission to demonstrate proper emergency response protocols, sir. I believe I can show what this school is truly capable of under realistic conditions." Principal Daniels stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Sir, this is highly irregular." She's not qualified. What makes you think you can succeed where trained staff have struggled? Hayes interrupted, his question directed at Sarah. Sarah opened her notebook, showing pages covered with precise calculations and diagrams. I've been studying this school for 3 years, sir. Every day recording evacuation routes, security vulnerabilities, response times. I understand the challenges here better than anyone present. Hayes examined her notes, his eyebrows rising at the professional-grade security assessments and emergency protocols. This wasn't the work of an amateur. This was the documentation of someone who'd been preparing for a crisis. Your husband trained you? Every day of our marriage until he died 4 years ago, sir. Sarah's voice remained steady, but Carter heard the emotion underneath. He taught me that preparation matters more than recognition, and that excellence doesn't require an audience. Hayes studied her for a long moment, seeing something in her posture that reminded him of the Major. The same patient stillness, the same quiet confidence that had preceded a life-saving evacuation during a devastating tornado. What do you propose, Mrs. Mitchell? Without hesitation, Sarah reached into her pocket and produced the worn challenge coin. A complete demonstration of proper emergency protocols, sir. Not the theatrical version you've been shown, but a realistic simulation of how to protect children during an actual crisis. The gymnasium erupted in murmurs. State officials stopped their conversations, security consultants turned back from their vehicles, and every staff member present stared at Sarah as if she'd proposed to walk on water. That's impossible, Daniel sputtered. A full emergency response simulation requires weeks of preparation and training. It can't be done on the spot. Sarah looked at him calmly. My husband always said impossible just means no one has tried it correctly yet. Hayes examined the challenge coin, noting its wear patterns and the way Sarah handled it with obvious reverence. This wasn't a publicity stunt or a desperate grab for attention. This was a wife trying to honor her husband's memory in the most meaningful way possible. If you fail, Hayes said quietly, you'll have embarrassed yourself and this school in front of the most senior education officials in the state. Yes, sir. I understand. And if you succeed, Sarah's eyes met his with unflinching directness. Then maybe people will remember that safety protocols aren't about looking good during demonstrations. They're about being prepared when children's lives are at stake. And maybe they'll understand that my husband's lessons didn't die with him. Hayes looked around the gymnasium, taking in the failed demonstrations, the disappointed officials, the staff who'd let him down. Then he looked back at Sarah, seeing not a volunteer mom but Thomas Mitchell's wife, carrying her husband's legacy in her steady hands. Ms. Carter, he said finally, allow Mrs. Mitchell to proceed with her demonstration. Daniel started to protest, but Hayes cut him off with a look that could have frozen fire. You had your chance, Principal. Now we'll see what real preparation looks like. As Carter moved toward the emergency equipment, Sarah felt the familiar calm that had always preceded her husband's most important training sessions. The noise of the crowd faded away, leaving only the whisper of her breathing across the silent gymnasium and the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. She was Thomas Mitchell's wife, and she was about to prove it to the world. Vice Principal Carter gathered the staff members, briefing them on their roles while Sarah examined the emergency equipment with practiced efficiency. Her hands moved over the items with precision, checking each piece as if lives actually depended on it, because in a real emergency, they would. What supplies do you need? Carter asked. Standard emergency kit, building blueprints, and the PA system, Sarah replied, her focus absolute. She selected several items from the emergency supplies, examining each one carefully before placing it in precise positions around the gymnasium. The state officials had moved closer, their earlier departure forgotten in the face of this unprecedented development. Security consultants readied their cameras, sensing that they were about to witness something extraordinary. Sarah took her position at the center of the gymnasium, and something fundamental changed in her bearing. The quiet volunteer disappeared, replaced by someone who'd inherited the emergency management skills of a legend. The equipment became extensions of her will, focused on a single purpose, demonstrating how to save lives when seconds count. Are you ready, Mrs. Mitchell? Hayes called out. Ready, sir. Sarah's breathing slowed to the measured rhythm her husband had taught her. 4 counts in, hold for 2, release for 4. Her world narrowed to the gymnasium layout, the staff positions, the mathematical precision of evacuation timing and emergency response. This demonstration will determine whether your husband's training was worth 4 years of patience, Hayes announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the gymnasium. Sarah felt the familiar stillness that preceded perfect execution. Her mind ran through the emergency protocols with the delicate precision of someone who'd rehearsed them thousands of times. The demonstration represented more than just a simulation. It was vindication, legacy, and the end of 3 years of being invisible. "Begin simulation, active shooter scenario," Hayes called out, and the school's alarm system blared to life. What happened next left everyone in the gymnasium speechless. Sarah transformed from a quiet volunteer into a commanding presence that seemed to be everywhere at once. Her voice cut through the chaos with crystal clarity as she implemented a completely different protocol than what the school had planned. East Wing classrooms, barricade and lockdown. West Wing, immediate evacuation through routes C and D. Administrative staff, establish command center at position 3. Security, defensive positions at junctions 7 and 9. The staff members, initially confused, found themselves responding to her commands with an instinctive trust born from her absolute certainty. Sarah moved through the simulation with the fluid grace of someone who'd mentally rehearsed this exact scenario hundreds of times. What would have been a disorganized mess under Daniel's leadership became a precisely choreographed emergency response. She redirected traffic flows, established clear communication chains, and implemented security measures that no one had even considered before. "Simulation Phase 2, injured student," Hayes called out, throwing an unexpected complication into the scenario. Without missing a beat, Sarah seamlessly integrated medical response into the evacuation. "Medical Team Alpha to Sector 4, establish triage at exit point B, continue evacuation through alternate route E." As the simulation progressed through increasingly complex scenarios, Sarah's command never faltered. She anticipated problems before they developed, redirected resources with perfect timing, and maintained complete situational awareness throughout the entire process. The most remarkable moment came when Hayes deliberately cut power to the gymnasium, plunging the simulation into darkness to test Sarah's ability to adapt. Without hesitation, her voice rose calmly in the blackness. "Emergency lighting protocol. Teams switch to radio communication. Maintain physical contact chains with students. Proceed to rally points using tactile guides on walls." When the lights came back on 2 minutes later, the entire demonstration had been successfully relocated to the predetermined rally point, with every student accounted for and every injury addressed according to proper triage protocols. The simulation ended after 43 minutes, the most comprehensive emergency response demonstration anyone present had ever witnessed. The gymnasium exploded in shocked silence, then erupted in cheers and applause. State officials were on their feet, security consultants were shouting into their phones, and staff members who'd been dismissive of Sarah moments before were staring at her with awe and disbelief. Governor Hayes stood in the middle of it all, looking at Sarah with something approaching reverence. The demonstration had been flawless, a masterclass in emergency management that professional security firms couldn't have matched. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hayes said, his voice carrying over the celebration, "you have just witnessed something that will change school safety protocols across this state." Sarah stood quietly, tears streaming down her face but her smile radiant. 3 years of invisible service, 4 years of carrying her husband's legacy in silence, and a lifetime of preparation had led to this single, perfect moment. Principal Daniels stood frozen in shock, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and the dawning realization that he'd been tormenting someone whose capabilities were beyond his comprehension. The teachers who'd mocked her looked ashamed, understanding that they'd been judging a master by the standards of beginners. Hayes walked over to Sarah, extending his hand. "Your husband would be proud," he said quietly. "What you just demonstrated was impossible by any reasonable standard." Sarah wiped her eyes and shook his hand firmly. "He used to say that impossible just means unpracticed, sir." Hayes removed his state emergency management pin and pressed it into Sarah's palm. "You don't represent this school, Mrs. Mitchell. From now on, this school should be proud to be represented by you." As the celebration continued around them, Vice Principal Carter approached Sarah with something approaching awe. "How did you know you could pull that off?" Sarah looked at the challenge coin, then at the gymnasium where she'd spent 3 years in patient preparation. "I didn't know for certain, Miss Carter, but my husband taught me that being ready isn't about certainty. It's about having the skills and courage to act when the moment demands it." The demonstration that transformed the school's emergency protocols had done more than showcase Sarah's skills. It had shattered assumptions, vindicated patience, and proved that excellence often comes from the most unexpected places. Lakeside Elementary would never underestimate the quiet observer again. The aftermath of Sarah's demonstration spread through Lakeside Elementary like wildfire. Within hours, the story had reached every corner of the school district, growing with each telling, but never losing its essential truth. The invisible volunteer mom had just pulled off the most impressive emergency response demonstration in the state's history. Governor Hayes called an immediate meeting with his education officials. Sarah found herself sitting in the superintendent's office, still wearing her blue jeans and casual sweater, the state emergency management pin now attached to her shirt collar. The two halves of her husband's challenge coin rested on the desk between them. "Mrs. Mitchell," Hayes began, his tone formal but respectful, "what happened today was extraordinary, but it also raises some serious questions about how we've been approaching school safety across the state." Quote, Principal Daniels shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The man who'd spent 3 years making Sarah's life miserable now looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "I've been reviewing your treatment of Mrs. Mitchell," Hayes continued, his steel-gray eyes fixed on Daniels, "and I'm not impressed with what I found." Daniels' face flushed. "Sir, I was just maintaining school protocols and proper administrative boundaries." "You were dismissing a woman whose qualifications exceed those of most professional security consultants." Hayes' voice cut through Daniels' excuses like a blade. "You prevented her from contributing to the school's safety because of your own prejudices and insecurities." Sarah watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction, not vindictive pleasure, but the deep contentment of someone who'd finally been vindicated after months of patient endurance. "Furthermore," Hayes continued, "you directly disobeyed standing directives about utilizing all available expertise. Mrs. Mitchell's knowledge of emergency protocols and security vulnerabilities could have prevented today's embarrassment if you'd had the wisdom to listen to her." Vice Principal Carter spoke up. "Sir, I've reviewed Sarah's volunteer logs and observations. Her documentation is more thorough than anything our paid security consultants have produced. She's been doing the work of a professional emergency manager while being treated like an unwelcome intruder." Hayes turned to Sarah. "What would you like to see happen here, Mrs. Mitchell?" Sarah considered the question carefully. She could have demanded apologies, transfers, or formal disciplinary action. But that wasn't why she'd spent 3 years carrying her husband's lessons. "I'd like to see Lakeside Elementary become a place where capability matters more than appearances," she said finally, "where quiet contributors are valued alongside the loud ones, where someone's potential isn't dismissed because they don't fit preconceived notions." Hayes nodded approvingly. "Principal Daniels, you're reassigned to administrative duties at the district office pending a full review of your conduct. Vice Principal Carter will take over as acting principal effective immediately." Daniel's career ambitions crumbled visibly, but Sarah felt no satisfaction in his downfall. Justice wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring that others wouldn't face the same dismissal and disrespect she'd endured. "Mrs. Mitchell," Hayes continued, "I'd like to offer you a position as our state's school safety program director. Your understanding of emergency protocols and practical implementation is exceptional, and your husband's training methods could benefit every school in the state." Sarah shook her head gently. "Thank you, sir, but I need to decline." The room fell silent. Hayes raised an eyebrow. "May I ask why?" Sarah looked down at the challenge coin, then back up at the governor. "For 3 years, I've been asking myself if I was good enough to honor my husband's memory. Today answered that question, not because I ran a perfect demonstration, but because I learned that excellence doesn't need recognition to have value." She stood, her voice gaining strength. "I came here to prove something to myself, and I did. But my husband didn't train me to be comfortable in one place. He trained me to carry his lessons wherever they're needed most." Hayes studied her with respect. "Where will you go?" "There are other schools where quiet observers are underestimated, sir. Other places where people need someone to believe in their potential." The meeting ended with handshakes and promises to stay in touch, but as Sarah walked out of the superintendent's office, she carried with her something more valuable than any job offer: the knowledge that she'd proven herself worthy of the name Mitchell. Meanwhile, word of the demonstration had already reached beyond Lakeside Elementary. State officials were making calls, security consultants were reviewing footage, and school districts across the country were hearing about the volunteer mom who'd revolutionized emergency response protocols in a single afternoon. Principal Daniels cleared out his office that evening, his superintendent dream shattered by his own prejudice. As he packed his belongings, he found himself thinking about all the times he'd dismissed Sarah's suggestions, all the expertise he'd ignored because it came from someone he'd considered beneath notice. Vice Principal Carter, promoted to acting principal effective immediately, instituted new policies that very day. Every volunteer would receive cross-training opportunities. Every suggestion would be evaluated on merit, not source. Every person working at the school would be treated with the respect due to a professional. The Mitchell Standard, she called it in her first memo to the staff. We judge people by their capabilities, not their appearances. We listen to expertise wherever we find it. And we remember that the person we underestimate most might be the one who saves our school. That evening, Sarah sat in her living room, packing the few mementos she'd accumulated during her 3 years at Lakeside Elementary. The challenge coin sat on her coffee table next to her husband's photograph, both pieces reflecting the lamplight like captured stars. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. Sarah Mitchell. This is Colonel James Blackwood from the National School Safety Council. We heard about what happened today at Lakeside Elementary. Sarah smiled. I'm listening. As the conversation continued, Sarah realized that her demonstration had done more than vindicate her husband's training. It had opened doors she'd never imagined, created possibilities she'd never considered. The quiet volunteer who'd been invisible for 3 years was about to become very visible indeed. But first, she had one more task to complete at Lakeside Elementary. The next morning arrived bright and cool, perfect for Sarah's final day at the school. She arrived at 7:30 a.m. as she had for 3 years, but this time she wasn't alone. Acting Principal Carter was waiting for her, along with a dozen teachers who'd requested to be there. We wanted to see you off properly, Carter explained, and maybe learn something before you go. Sarah smiled, touched by the gesture. These were some of the same teachers who'd ignored or mocked her just days before, but now they looked at her with genuine respect and curiosity. What would you like to know? She asked. Ms. Reynolds, the kindergarten teacher who'd always been kind to Sarah, stepped forward nervously. Mrs. Mitchell, how did you learn to manage emergency situations so well? I've been teaching for 20 years, and I still freeze up during drills. Sarah sat down, her notebook open, and looked at the group gathered around her. It's not about the procedures, she said. It's about the mindset. My husband taught me that emergency management is 90% preparation and 10% execution. She opened her notebook, showing pages of meticulous observations. Every day for 3 years, I've documented vulnerabilities, traffic patterns, blind spots, communication breakdowns. After a while, you start to see the school not as hallways and classrooms, but as flow patterns and decision points. She pointed to a notation from 3 months earlier. See this? On September 15th, the 3rd grade dismissal created a bottleneck at exit C, because Mr. Peterson's class always arrives 3 minutes early. Same pattern happened September 29th, October 13th, October 27th, every 2 weeks like clockwork, when their library visit ends early. The teachers gathered around, amazed by the depth of her documentation. This wasn't casual observation. This was professional-grade security assessment applied to everyday school operations. But the real lesson, Sarah continued, isn't about procedures or timings. It's about awareness. Excellence takes time to develop, and it usually happens when nobody's watching. She looked around at the faces surrounding her, young teachers eager to improve, experienced educators who'd learned humility from watching her demonstration, administrators who were rethinking their assumptions about capability and appearance. My husband used to say that the most dangerous assumption is that quiet people have nothing valuable to contribute. The second most dangerous assumption is that expertise always comes in expected packages. Mr. Collins, the newly appointed security coordinator, spoke up. What advice would you give to someone taking over school safety operations? Sarah considered the question. Listen more than you speak. Judge people by their actions over months, not their appearance in moments. And remember that the person who might save your school could be the one you notice least. She pulled out a manila envelope and handed it to Carter. These are all my observations from the past 3 years. Vulnerability assessments, traffic flow analyses, optimal evacuation routes for different scenarios. Maybe they'll help future students avoid some of the dangers we've overlooked. Carter accepted the envelope with reverence. This is incredible work, Sarah. Are you sure you won't reconsider staying? Sarah shook her head. I have other schools to help, other people to surprise. She smiled. Besides, Lakeside doesn't need Thomas Mitchell's wife anymore. You've learned the real lesson, which is that excellence rarely comes in expected packages. The most valuable team members often contribute quietly, consistently, without seeking recognition. And the person you underestimate most might be the one who saves your school. As Sarah prepared to leave, Ms. Reynolds approached her with something in her hand. Mrs. Mitchell, we wanted you to have this. Quote. It was a custom plaque, hastily but beautifully made. On one side was the Lakeside Elementary logo. On the other, an engraved challenge coin split perfectly in half, with the inscription, The Mitchell Standard, Excellence in Silence. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. Thank you, all of you. She walked to her modest sedan, the same unremarkable vehicle that had carried her to the school every morning for 3 years. As she drove away, she could see the teachers in her rearview mirror, still standing at the entrance, watching her departure with the respect reserved for legends. 3 months later, Acting Principal Carter received a package with a Wyoming postmark. Inside was a business card from Mitchell Security Consulting, with an address for a company that specialized in training school districts in emergency preparedness. The lead instructor was listed simply as S. Mitchell. Attached was a note. Ms. Carter, thank you for giving me the chance I'd been preparing for without knowing it. The Mitchell Standard is spreading. Last month, a quiet janitor at a high school in Montana proved he could identify security vulnerabilities that professional consultants had missed. 2 weeks ago, an overlooked librarian in Idaho demonstrated evacuation leadership that saved 30 children during an actual fire. Excellence doesn't require an audience, but it deserves opportunity. Sarah. Governor Hayes kept the Mitchell plaque in his office, mounted in a wooden frame with a simple inscription. Preparation proves that impossible is just another word for unprepared. The story spread throughout the education system faster than official reports. Within a year, it had become required reading at the National School Safety Council, used as a case study in leadership and human potential. School districts across the country instituted their own versions of the Mitchell Standard, creating opportunities for overlooked personnel to demonstrate hidden capabilities. But the most important legacy wasn't written in policy manuals or training curricula. It was written in the changed perspectives of everyone who witnessed Sarah's demonstration, everyone who heard the story, everyone who learned to look twice at the quiet person in the corner who might be carrying years of preparation, and the patience to wait for the right moment to prove it. Sarah had come to Lakeside Elementary to honor her husband's memory. She left having created a legacy that would outlast them both. The understanding that excellence often develops in silence, away from spotlights, in the hands of people who are underestimated until the moment they take their shot. And when they do, the whole world listens. 5 years later, Sarah Mitchell stood in the lobby of the Pentagon, waiting for her security escort. Her consulting company had grown from a one-woman operation to a nationally recognized leader in school safety and emergency response training. But today's meeting wasn't about business. It was about something far more personal. Mrs. Mitchell? A young Army captain approached her, his uniform pressed to perfection. I'm Captain Rivera. The secretary is ready to see you now. Sarah followed him through the labyrinthine corridors of the Pentagon, her mind drifting back to how much had changed since that afternoon at Lakeside Elementary. The quiet volunteer mom who'd been invisible for 3 years was now addressing congressional committees on school safety, consulting with Homeland Security on emergency response protocols, and training security teams across the country. Yet she still wore simple clothes, today a modest navy blazer over practical slacks, and kept her hair in the same practical ponytail. Some things never changed, nor should they. Mrs. Mitchell, the Secretary of Education, rose from behind his desk as she entered, extending his hand. Thank you for coming. I've heard a great deal about you. Thank you for inviting me, Mr. Secretary, Sarah replied, her voice carrying the same quiet confidence that had transformed a school gymnasium 5 years ago. The secretary gestured to the man standing by the window. I believe you already know Governor Hayes. Hayes turned, his face breaking into a warm smile. It's actually Secretary Hayes now, Sarah. Department of Homeland Security. But for you, still just Bill. Sarah shook his hand warmly. They'd crossed paths several times over the years as her reputation grew, and he'd become one of her strongest advocates in Washington. "Please, sit down." The education secretary gestured to the conference table where several other officials were already seated. "We have a proposal we'd like to discuss with you." Quote. Sarah took her seat, noting the impressive collection of officials gathered around the table, representatives from education, Homeland Security, and if she wasn't mistaken, that was the deputy director of the FBI at the far end. "Mrs. Mitchell," the education secretary began, "what you've accomplished over the past 5 years has been remarkable. The Mitchell Standard has been implemented in over 2,000 schools nationwide, and the data speaks for itself. A 63% reduction in response times during actual emergencies, a 48% improvement in evacuation efficiency, and most importantly, lives saved." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were news clippings. A school in Oregon where a secretary trained under the Mitchell Standard had successfully evacuated an entire elementary school minutes before a gas explosion. A high school in Florida where a maintenance worker had prevented a potential mass casualty event by identifying a student with weapons, thanks to the awareness protocols Sarah had developed. "We want to take this nationwide," the secretary continued. "A comprehensive school safety initiative based on your methods, implemented in every public school in America." Sarah studied the officials around the table, reading their expressions with the same careful attention she'd once applied to cataloging auction items at Lakeside Elementary. "That's a worthy goal," she said carefully, "but my methods aren't about equipment or technology or fancy protocols. They're about recognizing the potential in overlooked people. How do you plan to implement that on a national scale?" Hayes leaned forward. "That's exactly why we need you, Sarah. Not just your methods, but your perspective. We're proposing the creation of a National School Safety Academy, with you as its director. Full funding, full authority, hand-picked staff." Sarah was silent for a long moment, considering the offer. It was everything she'd worked toward. The chance to transform school safety across the entire country, to create a legacy that would protect millions of children. Yet something felt missing. "Before I answer," she said finally, "I'd like to tell you about a school I visited last month in rural Kentucky." The officials exchanged glances but nodded for her to continue. It was a small elementary school, badly underfunded, with outdated equipment and overworked staff. The principal was doing his best, but they were struggling. During my assessment, I noticed the cafeteria worker, a woman in her 50s who'd been there for 20 years. No one paid much attention to her. Sarah leaned forward, her voice intensifying. But this woman knew every child's name, noticed when their patterns changed, recognized when something was wrong. She had created her own informal security system based on nothing but attention and care. When I spoke with her, she showed me a notebook, not unlike the one I kept at Lakeside, where she documented her observations. She looked directly at the education secretary. That woman is the heart of what the Mitchell Standard really means. Not protocols or systems, but the recognition that safety comes from people who care enough to pay attention, regardless of their title or position. The secretary nodded slowly. "What are you suggesting, Mrs. Mitchell?" "I'll accept your offer on one condition," Sarah replied. "The academy doesn't just train security personnel or administrators. It identifies and elevates the overlooked contributors in every school. The janitors who know every corner of the building. The cafeteria workers who notice when children's patterns change. The bus drivers who are the first and last line of defense in a child's school day." She placed her hand on the folder containing the news clippings. These success stories weren't just about my training. They were about giving voice and authority to people who've been silenced and dismissed. If we're going to do this right, that has to be the foundation. The room was silent as the officials considered her proposal. Finally, Hayes smiled. "I think you've just outlined the core mission statement for the academy, Sarah. When can you start?" 6 months later, Sarah stood on the stage of the newly established National School Safety Academy, preparing to address its first class of trainees. Behind her was a large photograph of Thomas Mitchell in his dress uniform, his steady gaze watching over the proceedings. The auditorium was filled with an unusual mix. School administrators sat alongside janitors, cafeteria workers next to security specialists, bus drivers beside teachers. Every person selected not for their title or credentials, but for their demonstrated commitment to the safety of children. "Welcome to the first class of the Mitchell Academy," Sarah began, her voice carrying across the silent room. You've been chosen not because of your positions, but because someone recognized in you the same qualities I once had to hide: attentiveness, dedication, and the courage to speak up when necessary. She stepped away from the podium, preferring to address them directly. Some of you have been overlooked for years. Some of you have been told to stay in your lane. Some of you have watched as your concerns were dismissed because of who you are rather than what you know. Sarah moved along the edge of the stage, making eye contact with individuals throughout the audience. That ends today. Here, we recognize that safety doesn't come from titles or authority. It comes from the person who notices that a door doesn't latch properly. The person who realizes a child's behavior has changed. The person who sees the flaw in the evacuation plan that everyone else has missed. She pulled out her husband's challenge coin, now restored with its golden seam holding the two halves together. My husband used to say that in a crisis, the person who saves you probably isn't who you expect. It's the quiet one who's been paying attention all along. Sarah held up the coin so everyone could see it. This was split in half the day I stopped being invisible. I keep it to remind myself that broken things can be made whole, that overlooked people can become leaders, that silence can transform into purpose. She pocketed the coin and looked out at the faces watching her, earnest, hopeful, ready to learn. For the next 12 weeks, you'll undergo the most comprehensive security and emergency response training ever developed. You'll learn from experts in every field, from psychology to structural engineering. You'll participate in simulations so realistic that your instincts will be forever changed. Sarah paused, letting her words sink in. But the most important thing you'll learn isn't in any manual. It's that the true measure of security isn't in equipment or protocols. It's in people who care enough to prepare, to watch, and when necessary to act decisively. As the training program began, Sarah worked tirelessly alongside her carefully selected instructors. The Mitchell method wasn't just about emergency response. It was about creating a fundamental shift in how school safety was understood. Janitors weren't just taught to recognize security vulnerabilities, they were empowered to address them. Cafeteria workers didn't just learn to observe behavioral changes, they became essential components of threat assessment teams. Bus drivers weren't just trained in evacuation procedures, they developed community safety networks that extended protection beyond school grounds. The most powerful moments came when trainees who had been silenced for years finally found their voices. A maintenance worker from Alabama who'd been trying to report a dangerous electrical issue for 3 years finally learned how to document and present his concerns effectively. A school secretary from Minnesota whose observations about a troubled student had been repeatedly dismissed learned to translate her intuition into actionable intelligence. During a particularly challenging simulation halfway through the program, Sarah stood in the control room watching as teams responded to a complex crisis scenario. One team was struggling, falling into the same patterns of hierarchy and dismissal that plagued so many schools. Pause the simulation, she instructed the technicians, then entered the simulation room where the team stood, frustrated and divided. "What's happening here?" she asked quietly. The team administrator, a principal from Oregon, spoke up immediately. "We're having communication issues. The protocols aren't being followed correctly." Sarah nodded and turned to the youngest member of the team, a school bus driver who hadn't spoken once during the exercise. "What do you see happening?" The woman looked startled to be addressed directly, but gathered her courage. "The evacuation route they're using passes too close to the simulated threat. I drive that section every day in my school, and there's a blind corner that creates a vulnerability. I tried to mention it, but..." She trailed off, glancing at the principal. "But your observation was dismissed," Sarah finished for her. She turned to the principal. "Why?" The man had the grace to look uncomfortable. "We were following standard protocols. There wasn't time to consider alternatives." "There's always time to consider information that might save lives," Sarah replied, her voice gentle but firm. "Especially from someone who sees that route from a different perspective every single day." She addressed the entire team. The Mitchell Standard isn't about following protocols blindly. It's about creating an environment where every observation is valued, where hierarchy doesn't trump common sense, where the person with the least authority might have the most valuable insight. The principal nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "We need to start over, and this time we're all going to listen to each other, regardless of title." When the simulation resumed, the transformation was remarkable. The team moved with unified purpose, drawing on each member's unique perspective and knowledge. What had been chaos became coordination. What had been conflict became collaboration. As the Academy's first class neared graduation, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Vice Principal, now Superintendent Carter, arrived one afternoon, watching from the back of a training session as Sarah guided participants through a complex scenario. "You've come a long way from arranging bake sales," Carter said when they finally had a moment alone. Sarah smiled. "From the outside, maybe, but I'm still doing what I've always done, paying attention to details others miss, preparing for moments that matter." "Lakeside misses you," Carter said, "but your impact is still felt every day. The Mitchell Standard has become part of our DNA." She handed Sarah an envelope. Inside was a newspaper clipping about a recent incident at Lakeside. A kitchen fire that could have been catastrophic, but was contained because the new custodian, trained under protocols Sarah had developed, had noticed the danger signs and acted before it spread. "He said he remembered something you wrote in your safety manual," Carter explained. "The person who prevents a crisis will never receive as much recognition as the person who responds to one, but has saved infinitely more." Sarah's eyes misted slightly as she read the article. He got it exactly right. On graduation day, the Academy's first class gathered in the auditorium, no longer the disparate group they'd been 12 weeks earlier. They had been transformed, not just in their skills and knowledge, but in their understanding of their own worth and potential. Sarah stood before them, immensely proud of what they'd accomplished. "Today, you return to your schools carrying more than just training," she told them. "You carry a new perspective, that safety isn't created by systems, but by people. That observation is our most powerful tool, that the quiet voice with the inconvenient question might be the one that saves a life." Quote, she looked out at their faces, seeing in them the same determination that had driven her through 3 years of patient preparation at Lakeside Elementary. "Some of you will face resistance when you return. Some will find that old habits of dismissal and hierarchy are deeply entrenched. When that happens, remember this: excellence doesn't require an audience, but it does require courage. The courage to speak when others would prefer silence. The courage to act when others hesitate. The courage to lead, even from the shadows." As the graduates filed across the stage to receive their certifications, Sarah shook each hand, looking into each face, recognizing in them the future of school safety in America. Not flashy technology or elaborate protocols, but attentive, dedicated people who understood that true security came from seeing what others missed. That evening, alone in her office, Sarah added the newspaper clipping from Lakeside to her collection. Stories of lives saved, crises averted, communities protected. She opened her desk drawer and took out her husband's challenge coin, running her finger along the golden seam that had made it whole again. "We did it, Tom," she whispered to the empty room. "Your lessons live on in places you never imagined, through people you never met." She thought of the quiet cafeteria worker in Kentucky who would start her academy training next month, the overlooked bus driver from Minnesota who had already prevented a potential abduction using her new observation skills, the janitor from Alabama whose persistent safety concerns were now being addressed by a newly attentive administration. These were the true embodiments of the Mitchell Standard, not Sarah herself, but the countless overlooked individuals who had finally found their voices and their purpose. People who understood that excellence didn't require recognition to have value, but who had found, at last, the recognition their excellence deserved. The quiet mom who had been invisible for 3 years had become a catalyst for transformation across the nation, proving that sometimes the most powerful people are the ones you notice least, until they assemble the pieces of their purpose with the precision and speed that leaves the world in awe. And when they do, everything changes. 10 years after that fateful demonstration at Lakeside Elementary, Sarah Mitchell found herself back in Washington, D.C., but under very different circumstances. The National School Safety Advisory Board had gathered for its annual conference, and this year's focus was on celebrating a decade of the Mitchell Standard, a methodology that had revolutionized school security across America and was now being adopted internationally. As Sarah entered the grand ballroom of the hotel where the conference was being held, she couldn't help but reflect on the journey. The quiet mom who once organized bake sales now advised presidents and prime ministers. The woman once dismissed as just logistics now had her name attached to protocols that had saved countless lives. Yet she still wore her hair in a practical ponytail, still carried the same worn notebook, and still approached each day with the same methodical attention to detail. Some habits were worth keeping. "There she is," called out a familiar voice, and Sarah turned to see former governor, now retired Secretary Hayes, approaching with open arms. "The woman who changed everything." Sarah embraced him warmly. "Good to see you, Bill. How's retirement treating you?" "Better than I deserve," he laughed. "Though Marjorie says I'm driving her crazy with all my home improvement projects." Turns out running Homeland Security was easier than fixing the guest bathroom. Before she could respond, Sarah was surrounded by academy graduates, men and women who had once been invisible in their schools but now served as safety directors, emergency coordinators, and in some cases, school administrators. They greeted her not with the awe of disciples but with the warm respect of colleagues who shared a mission. "Mrs. Mitchell," said Carmen Diaz, once a cafeteria worker from Kentucky, now the National Director of School Threat Assessment, "we have a surprise for you later. Don't try to sneak out early." Sarah raised an eyebrow but knew better than to press for details. If the Mitchell Academy had taught its graduates anything, it was how to keep secrets when necessary. The conference opened with presentations highlighting the remarkable results of the past decade. A 78% reduction in school-related casualties during emergency situations, a 64% decrease in successful attacks on school campuses, and most impressively, a fundamental shift in how school safety was conceptualized. Dr. Marcus Bennett, a behavioral psychologist who had initially been skeptical of Sarah's methods, presented his 10-year study on the cultural impact of the Mitchell Standard. "What we've witnessed isn't just a change in protocols," he explained to the packed ballroom. "It's a transformation in perspective. Before the Mitchell Standard, school safety was primarily reactive, responding to crises after they occurred. Now it's proactive, preventing crises before they develop." He clicked to a slide showing before and after organizational charts. But the most profound change has been in who participates in safety planning. Before, it was a top-down hierarchy. Now it's a collaborative network that values input from every level of the school community. Sarah listened from her seat near the back of the room, preferring, as always, to observe rather than be observed. There was satisfaction in hearing the academic validation of what she'd always known intuitively, that safety wasn't created by authority, but by attention, not by power, but by perspective. During the lunch break, Sarah slipped away from the crowd, finding a quiet corner of the hotel garden to collect her thoughts. She pulled out her husband's challenge coin, now a talisman she carried everywhere, its golden seam catching the sunlight. "Mind if I join you?" Sarah looked up to find Jessica Carter, her ally from Lakeside Elementary, now the superintendent of one of the largest school districts in the country. "Please," Sarah gestured to the bench beside her. "It's good to see you, Jessica." Carter sat down, eyeing the challenge coin. "Still carrying that, I see." "Always," Sarah smiled, returning it to her pocket. "It reminds me where this all started." "That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about," Carter said. "Have you seen who's registered for the conference?" Sarah shook her head. "I don't usually check the attendance lists." "Robert Daniels is here." The name hung in the air between them. Principal Daniels, the man who had dismissed Sarah as just a mom, who had mocked her suggestions and relegated her to organizing bake sales. "Is he?" Sarah's voice remained neutral, betraying none of the complex emotions the name evoked. Carter nodded. "He's the assistant superintendent in a small district in Nevada now. Asked specifically if he could attend your keynote tomorrow." Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "It's been 10 years, Jessica. People change." "That's what I've heard," Carter agreed. Apparently, he's become quite the advocate for the Mitchell Standard in his district. Insists that every employee, regardless of position, receives full safety training. Sarah smiled slightly. "Life has a way of teaching us the lessons we need most, doesn't it?" Later that afternoon, as Sarah made her way to a panel discussion on international implementation of the Mitchell Standard, she spotted him, Robert Daniels, older now, his hair grayed at the temples, standing somewhat awkwardly near the exhibition hall. Their eyes met across the crowded lobby. For a moment, neither moved. Then Sarah approached him, her steps measured and deliberate as always. "Mr. Daniels," she said, extending her hand. "It's been a long time." He took her hand, his expression a complex mixture of embarrassment and respect. "Mrs. Mitchell, I wasn't sure you'd remember me." "I remember everyone from Lakeside. she replied evenly. "I've been following your work," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "What you've accomplished with the academy, the Mitchell Standard, it's remarkable." Sarah studied him, seeing not just the man who had dismissed her, but someone who appeared to have done his own growing in the intervening years. "I hear you've implemented the standard in your district," she said. Daniels nodded, some of his nervousness falling away as he moved to familiar professional ground. "Completely. Full training for every staff member, collaborative security planning, the works." He hesitated, then added, "I make sure no one gets overlooked, regardless of their position." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. "I'm glad to hear it," Sarah said simply. "Mrs. Mitchell?" Daniels began, then stopped, gathering himself. "Sarah, I owe you an apology. The way I treated you at Lakeside, it was inexcusable." Sarah had imagined this moment many times over the years, wondering how she would feel, what she would say. The reality was simpler than any scenario she'd envisioned. "Thank you for saying that," she replied. "But in a way, your dismissal was the catalyst that led to all of this." She gestured to the conference around them. "Sometimes our greatest contributions come from our mistakes." Daniels looked at her with new appreciation. "You're very gracious." "Not gracious," Sarah corrected him gently. "Practical. Holding on to old grievances doesn't serve the mission, and the mission has always been what matters most." Quote. They spoke for a few more minutes, Daniels sharing some of the successes his district had achieved using her methods, Sarah listening with genuine interest. As they parted ways, she felt a sense of completion. A circle closing. The woman who had once been invisible to him was now someone he traveled hundreds of miles to learn from. That evening came the surprise Carmen Diaz had hinted at earlier. As the formal dinner concluded, Hayes took the podium, calling for the room's attention. "We have a special presentation tonight," he announced. "Something that's been in the works for quite some time, without our guest of honor's knowledge." Sarah felt a moment of apprehension. She'd never been comfortable in the spotlight, preferring to do her work without fanfare. 10 years ago, Hayes continued, a school volunteer demonstrated that excellence often hides in plain sight. Since then, the Mitchell Standard has transformed how we approach school safety across this nation and beyond. But its impact goes far deeper than protocols and procedures. The lights dimmed, and a video began playing on the large screens around the ballroom. Sarah recognized the first face immediately. Jason Torres, once a janitor at a high school in New Mexico, now the safety director for his entire district. "I was invisible for 17 years, Torres said directly to the camera, "the guy with the mop who nobody really saw. Then I attended the Mitchell Academy, and for the first time, someone valued what I observed every day. Last year, that observation prevented what could have been a tragic shooting at our school." The video continued with face after face. The bus driver who spotted a suspicious vehicle following her route, the cafeteria worker who noticed a student's concerning behavioral changes, the maintenance worker who identified a structural vulnerability during an earthquake drill. All of them had once been overlooked. All of them had been transformed by the recognition that their perspective mattered. All of them had saved lives because someone finally listened. The final testimony came from a young woman Sarah didn't recognize. "My name is Emily Williams," she began. "I was a third-grade student at Lakeside Elementary 12 years ago. I was there the day Mrs. Mitchell demonstrated proper emergency protocols for Governor Hayes." Sarah leaned forward, surprised. "I didn't understand what was happening then," Emily continued. "I just knew that the quiet mom who always smiled at me in the hallway suddenly became the person everyone listened to. It made an impression that shaped my life." The camera pulled back to reveal Emily in a police uniform. "Today, I'm a school resource officer in my hometown, trained in the Mitchell Standard. I make sure that every voice in my school is heard, that every observation is valued, that no one with something important to contribute is ever invisible. Because Mrs. Mitchell showed me that sometimes the person who seems least important might be the one who saves us all." As the video ended, the lights came up to reveal a stage full of Academy graduates, hundreds of them, representing every state and 23 countries. At the center stood Emily Williams, now in person, holding something in her hands. "Mrs. Mitchell," Hayes said, "please join us on stage." Sarah moved forward, overwhelmed by the sight of so many faces, so many lives, touched by what had begun as one quiet woman's determination to honor her husband's legacy. As she reached the stage, Emily stepped forward. "Mrs. Mitchell, we created something to mark the 10th anniversary of the Mitchell Standard." She opened a wooden box to reveal a medallion, gold, in the shape of a challenge coin, but larger. On one side was an engraving of a school building. On the other, a simple inscription: "Excellence rises from the shadows when every voice is heard." "This isn't just for you," Emily explained. "It's the first of many. From now on, every year, each Academy graduate will nominate someone from their school who embodies the Mitchell Standard, the overlooked contributor whose quiet excellence makes everyone safer. They'll receive this medallion and a full scholarship to the Academy." Sarah accepted the box, touched beyond words. It wasn't a monument to her. It was a continuation of the mission, ensuring that no one with valuable perspective would remain invisible. "The Mitchell Legacy Program," Hayes announced to applause. "Ensuring that what began with one overlooked mom continues to discover hidden excellence for generations to come." The next morning, Sarah delivered her keynote address to the conference, not from prepared notes, but from the same quiet confidence that had always guided her work. 10 years ago, she began, I was known simply as Cupcake Mom at my son's elementary school. My suggestions were dismissed, my observations ignored, my potential unrecognized. It's a story that resonates with many of you because you lived similar experiences. She moved away from the podium, preferring as always to connect directly with her audience. But this anniversary isn't about vindicating the overlooked. It's about recognizing a fundamental truth, that safety doesn't come from authority, but from attention. Not from power, but from perspective. Not from title, but from tenacity. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out her husband's challenge coin, holding it up for all to see. My husband used to say that in a crisis, the person who saves you is rarely who you expect. It's the one who's been quietly preparing while no one was watching. The one who noticed what everyone else missed. The one who speaks up when it matters most, even if they've been silenced before. She looked out at the audience. School administrators and janitors, security directors and cafeteria workers, all united by a shared commitment to the safety of children. The true power of the Mitchell Standard isn't in its protocols or procedures. It's in its fundamental recognition that every perspective matters, that observation is our most powerful tool, and that excellence can come from the most unexpected sources. Sarah returned the coin to her pocket and continued with quiet intensity. As we move into the next decade of this work, our challenge isn't just to maintain what we've built, but to constantly seek out the voices still unheard, the perspectives still overlooked, the excellence still hidden in the shadows of our schools. She gestured to the diverse faces before her. Look around this room. 10 years ago, many of you would never have been invited to a conference like this. Your insights, your observations, your expertise would have been dismissed because of your title or position. Today, you are the leaders transforming school safety across the nation and around the world. Sarah paused, letting the weight of that transformation sink in. That's the true measure of our success, not in statistics or studies, though those matter, but in the fundamental shift in who participates in keeping our children safe. Every voice, every perspective, every day. As she concluded her address, Sarah knew this was just another milestone in a journey that would continue long after her. The Mitchell Standard had taken on a life of its own, growing and evolving beyond anything she could have imagined that day in Lakeside Elementary's gymnasium. Later that afternoon, Sarah slipped away from the conference for a private moment. She had one more stop to make before returning to Wyoming, where her consulting firm was based. Arlington National Cemetery was peaceful in the late afternoon light, the rows of white headstones stretching in perfect alignment across the rolling hills. Sarah made her way to a familiar location, having visited whenever she was in Washington over the past decade. Major Thomas Mitchell's headstone was simple, like the thousands surrounding it, but to Sarah it had always stood apart. She knelt beside it, placing a fresh bouquet of flowers at its base. "Hello, Tom," she said softly. "It's been quite a decade." She told him about the conference, about the Mitchell Legacy Program, about Emily Williams and all the lives that had been touched by what they'd started together. As she spoke, she ran her fingers over the engraved letters of his name, feeling the connection that neither time nor death had diminished. "I'm not sure this is what you had in mind when you taught me about emergency protocols," she smiled. but I think you'd approve of how it turned out." She pulled the challenge coin from her pocket, holding it in her palm where the sunlight caught the golden seam that joined its once broken halves. "You always said that preparation matters more than recognition, that excellence doesn't need an audience to have value." She closed her fingers around the coin. "But you never said what happens when excellence finally finds its audience, when preparation meets opportunity, when the invisible become visible." Sarah stood, her hand resting for a moment on the cool stone. "What happens, Tom, is transformation, not just for one person, but for an entire system. Not just for a moment, but for generations." As she walked back through the cemetery, Sarah's phone buzzed with a message. The Mitchell Academy director was forwarding a news article about a potential threat averted at a high school in Oregon, thanks to a custodian who'd noticed suspicious behavior and spoke up immediately. Another life saved, another crisis prevented, another proof that the most important people in any organization were often the ones least recognized, until someone gave them a voice, a platform, a chance to demonstrate what they'd known all along. Sarah smiled as she put her phone away. The quiet mom who'd been dismissed as just logistics had changed the world not through dramatic heroics, but through the simple, revolutionary act of recognizing that excellence exists everywhere, often hidden in plain sight. As the sun began to set over Arlington, casting long shadows across the endless rows of headstones, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her here, from organizing bake sales to advising presidents, from being silenced to creating a legacy that gave voice to the voiceless. She remembered the moment that had started it all, standing in a school gymnasium, challenging the assumptions of everyone present, demonstrating skills no one believed she possessed. The day they stopped calling her just a mom and started listening to what she had to say. The Mitchell Standard had begun with one woman's determination to honor her husband's legacy. It would continue through thousands of overlooked individuals finally given the chance to show what they could do when someone finally paid attention. Because sometimes the most powerful people are the ones you notice least, until they assemble the pieces of safety with such precision and speed that they leave the world changed forever. And when they do, nothing is ever the same again. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.